My name is Jackie Kitching, and I'm here to discuss my reflection on how slam poetry has evolved over time. I chose this question and focus as I have a really strong connection to this genre and form of poetry. As a teenager in high school, this was my entry point into appreciating poetry and language features, and I believe the way this practice fuses with social commentary and projection of minority voices is really significant in today's modern society. Within my experience in the classroom, I think it is so essential to get students passionate about what they are reading and writing, which is what I've aimed to capture in this reflection. I've incorporated a variety of teaching strategies as per AITSL Standard 2.1 and aim to demonstrate how limitless this genre is in teaching. I think it blends really beautifully with teaching the literary genres, as expression of minority voices in history is so significant to social change. Particularly in schools with a strong social justice presence, I think this approach to the genre and literary eras would work really well with students. I initially began researching this topic by coming across this 2016 article by Muhammad and Gonzalez outlining slam poetry as a form of activism. This really aligned with how I perceive performance poetry to function, so this was a great starting point. From here, the potency of teaching slam to adolescents became quite clear to me, particularly as youth begin their identity formation, and performance poetry can really help them in that exploration. Understanding context and being able to make sense of the world as both a stage 4 and 5 English skill and also just a general life skill is really significant to me and something I aim to help my students learn in the classroom. Following this, I believe the study of history and literary eras is an essential foundation for this skill, particularly looking at the role of language in history and the role language played in reclaiming power for minority groups is a really fascinating point to consider, and I do approach that in my reflection. One really significant concept for me that I wanted to address was acknowledging voice and storytelling's existence and meaning before physical records of language, so prior to Old English and where the teaching literary era usually begins. The role of verbal storytelling in ancient societies, most significantly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, history and culture, I think is particularly imperative to understand when looking at the evolution of performance poetry. This beautiful cycle of language and the recognition that humans have been using language techniques to pass knowledge and remember has come full circle, and we're returning to this beautiful and ancient practice to express again. But getting back to my reflection, I wanted to discuss one way that could engage students with this concept who may approach learning poetry with some anxieties. And this was to begin this unit with this fantastic Vox video about Kanye West. The focus is on voice and uses examples from Kanye's rap songs to show all the different ways producers can play with voice and the different effects that this can have. So, depending on stage and familiarity with Shakespeare, it may even be worthwhile discussing iambic pentameter and other prose forms to get them thinking about voice in that way. But essentially, this resource can be really effective in hooking students in with a familiar and interesting perspective on this concept of the human voice. Hooper 2009 outlines the benefits of using rap to teach poetry has, and how this is a great entry point for students who are resistant. So, following this viewing with familiar rap verses and a discussion on significant language techniques within those songs could be a great way to get students involved and engaged. Following this introduction, I provided multiple examples of slam poetry to fit diverse groups of learners. So I have Changing the World One Word at a Time, which is done by three American girls. I have Luca Lessons' Please Resist Me, Oma Musa's Fireflies, and this last one here is a curation of about 60 classroom-friendly slam poems by Button Poetry. So, in my experience of teaching slam poetry, knowing your students' values, concerns, and maturity levels really influences the poems you want to show them. So, these here are a good place to start. This last playlist might be a really good way to allow for individuals to follow what they want to learn. So, maybe providing this list to students, and then in individuals or pairs, students can follow their own interests and narrow down what they want to explore more deeply. In the explicit teaching of literary eras, I've also provided a basic research scaffold for some of the larger scale eras, such as the Enlightenment period or the Industrial Revolution. This may not be fitting for a unit teaching explicitly slam poetry, but can be used for poetry through the ages and eras. I've used this scaffold in the past and it works quite well in allowing students to look holistically at a time period to really understand how culture impacts individuals and expression and therefore literature. Within this reflection, I have considered the evolution of slam poetry from ancient times and then its rising presence in the 1950s during the Beat generation. I have used Ferlinghetty's poem I Am Waiting, which is comprised of 6 stanzas and is a great reflection of this literary era. This would be a great poem to chop up and allocate to different groups based on ability or interest, and then come back together as a class to share what students got from the poem. I've also mentioned the turning point in the 1980s, where Mark Smith developed poetry slam competitions with the intent to make poetry engaging and exciting again. So this was the big leap that performance poetry needed to become what it is today. I think stressing this point to students about how slam poetry is about opening conversations and individual expression is really significant in their engagement. For a postmodern context, I have looked at Melanie Monunga Williams' I Run, which is a beautiful demonstration of a modern Australian voice. I have provided a mind map, which could be used to guide students in their identification of language techniques to demonstrate certain ideas. So this could be used around the classroom, and each of these little thought bubbles could be a starting point for students to start analysing the text and looking at how language techniques and poetic techniques have shown these ideas. Oh, excuse me. So one way that I've sought to support my students' understanding of how the tension between human expression and context within the literary eras is getting them to compose their own texts. So Wong 2016 has provided a lesson plan and some further examples to help guide students' development of their poems. So this includes acknowledgement of techniques common in slam poems, as well as an editing and reflection process for students. This lesson plan could easily be chopped and changed to fit any stage, ability, or interest. This example here of Shrinking Women by Lily Myers would be a great text to share with students who have a particular interest in feminism. I think overall that slam poetry is an accessible and meaningful way for students to engage with literature, history, and literary eras, and also is just a beautiful way to foster student expression and personal development of identity within the classroom.